Hey, Jamie here, and welcome to Module 7, Part 1, where we're going to start diving into the networking. And specifically in Part 1, we're going to break down how to approach it in a way that's easy to do. It's not awkward or uncomfortable for either you or the person you're reaching out to, and you actually build deep relationships. So by this point, we've already covered the personal branding and how you're going to be positioning yourself both on your LinkedIn and on your resume, and all that's set. So now this is the first part where we're going to talk about entering the marketplace and reaching out to people and building relationships. So in part 1, we're going to understand how time and energy investment affect perceived value. And then we're also going to understand the philosophy of a relationship-driven networking and how that's different from transaction-driven networking. And we'll break down both of those. And then finally, understand which networking approach you need for building deep relationships. And ultimately, the point of those relationships is those are the people that will help you. Networking is based on people. People are your greatest resource. They're your greatest asset. And that is a core belief that I have, and it's a core belief that I would love for you to ingrain in your nature as well. People are always the answer, almost always the answer. So they're your greatest asset, your greatest resource. So I love to start with a fun metaphor, and it's an example of investment. So when you take a look at this, even if it's not something that you would actually buy, how much would you pay for this? Come up with a number in your head. Okay, so keep that number in your head of how much you'd pay for this, that dollar amount in your head. Now, how much would you value this same desk if you personally built it? If you dedicated 13 hours of sweat and blood and tears building this thing, and all of a sudden you now needed to sell it to somebody, how much would you sell it for? Okay, and now another example of investment and how it affects value. So which of these is typically valued more by people, a high school diploma or a university diploma? In most cases, most people value their university diploma more. And usually, if someone had to choose between one or the other, which of these is a greater accomplishment? A half marathon or a full marathon? In most cases, people say a full marathon. Now, I did have someone point out, well, what if you broke a record and it was running a half marathon? All right, well, in that case, the half marathon. But usually, in most cases, the greater the effort, the greater the investment, the greater the value. So this is what's called the Ikea Effect. And this was found by some Harvard researchers, and we'll talk about that in a second. But really what the Ikea Effect says is you as a human being have a normal bias. It's a cognitive bias where you place a disproportionately high value on something, and in this case, a product that this person partially created. So if you've ever been to Ikea, you're actually like buying pieces of the furniture and you construct it yourself. So they found that people actually value the furniture that they partially built themselves at a higher dollar amount than pre-assembled furniture. So the IKEA Effect, the name derives from the Swedish manufacturer IKEA, which sells furniture that requires assembly. So what this is getting at is the more time, the more effort, and also as well, if you're investing money, whatever your investment is, the greater the investment, the greater the perceived value. You become personally invested in something. So Michael Norton, a researcher at Harvard Business School, as well as two other colleagues, found that consumers value their personally built furniture by up to 63% more than the same furniture pre-assembled. That's pretty crazy. Saying that someone who partially built something out of the clear blue now values it 63% higher. And really what the basis of this test was they had several people build their furniture and they asked questions beforehand. How much do you believe that this furniture would be worth? And then after those people had built it, they asked them the same questions. If you were to sell this furniture, how much would you charge someone? On average, that was a 63% increase in value, just because they now felt personally invested in their own furniture. And we also see this in the marketplace with businesses. So strategically, people and companies often struggle with sunk costs. And I'm sure that you've probably heard this before. And as a high-level definition, really what a sunk cost is it's typically an underperforming asset or project. But the reason it's so tricky is because whoever that person is, and if it's you in this case, a sunk cost is something that you've invested significantly into. So that could be time, effort, or money. And because of this cognitive bias, sunk costs are often overvalued. And we see this across every industry, across every manager, and especially across entrepreneurs and leaders. So how much time, effort, and money that we put into something directly increases our perceived value of it. And how do you believe that this relates to professional networking? Well, relationships work the exact same way. The more time, the more effort, and the more money that we invest into another person or that someone invests into us, the more valuable and important that relationship becomes to either us or to them. And the easiest example to think about this is think of an intimate relationship that either you've had or maybe your parents or someone you know, whether it's a friend or a family member, etc. But you can't have an intimate relationship with someone, or it's very difficult to sustain an intimate, passionate relationship with someone when there's no time investment, when there's no effort investment, and when you're not willing to invest in the relationship. Things fall apart. Well, it's because when you're not investing time or money or effort into a relationship, you're inadvertently communicating to the other person it's not important to you. Well, of course, that relationship's going to fall apart. Well, on the opposite side is if someone is investing a lot into the relationship, you and them become much more invested. So, professionally, that's very important for us to know, because professional relationships are still human relationships. They work the same way as an intimate relationship. They're just more formal. So, as two examples I'd love to give, most people have had these experiences in their life. So, have you ever spent time with someone, given that person solid advice, and they ended up not taking it? And how did that make you feel? More often than not, you didn't appreciate it. And you probably ended up very frustrated, and you probably asked yourself, why did I waste my time? If they're not going to take my advice, why did they ask me? And two, why did I actually go through with it? Why did I waste my time? And I guarantee you probably won't do it again, because that person has taught you, well, if you're going to give them advice and they're not going to take it, why would you ever do it again? So you stop giving advice. Then the second example is, have you ever spent time helping someone prepare for something or to do something, and then later on, that person never bothered to let you know how things turned out? They never told you if they got the interview or got the job. They never told you if they ended up dating the person. They never told you if they ended up finishing, top 5 in a project or in a competition or whatever. They didn't tell you the result. How did that make you feel? And it probably made you feel, again, frustrated, upset, maybe even angry, or maybe sad. Everybody responds to these things differently, but the reason you actually had an emotional response to it was because you had become emotionally invested. You had invested time, effort, and sometimes money into that person's success, whether that's through giving advice or whether that's helping them prepare or if it's investing money into them. You became invested, and because of that, when they didn't get back to you, you felt like there was no return on your investment. It emotionally, you had an emotional response to it. So once someone has invested time and effort into your success, that person is more likely to continue investing in you. And the more that someone else invests in you, the more they're willing to respond to larger asks. Now, most people have heard of the foot in the door technique. Ask something small and then eventually they'll respond to something big. Well, it sounds like manipulation, but really all that's saying is it's pointing to this bias, this psychological tendency, this human behavior. That's really what this is. It's a behavioral pattern that we have. Almost, I would say the vast majority of human beings on this planet have this tendency that once they feel invested in something, they feel attached to it and they want to continue investing more into it because they want a larger return. Once someone invests in you and they want you to succeed, they're willing to do more to help you succeed because they've already started to invest in you. So, after multiple positive interactions with someone, you also develop trust and rapport. But then The question that naturally really should pop into your head and everyone else's head and naturally popped into my head is, all right, well, what is trust? What is rapport? How do I know how to build them if I don't know what they are? So the three questions, but what is trust? How do you define it? And how do you value it are really important questions to answer. And the way that we can think about trust is nothing more than a set of conditioned beliefs that you or someone else holds about another person or a thing. And more importantly, trust is valued subjectively. And the reason it's valued subjectively is because it's perceived differently by every person. What you believe and whether or not you trust someone or something could be totally different than someone else deciding whether or not they trust that same thing or that same person. Trust is in the eyes of the individual. So, we create, mold, condition, and strengthen every belief in our lives, consciously and subconsciously. So if you remember when we talked about mindset transformation and how are beliefs conditioned, well, if trust is a belief, trust is built and conditioned the exact same way as any other belief in our life. We have a first reference point, which is when we first come into contact with someone or something. We have more references with that person or that thing, and eventually even more, until eventually we have a deep-rooted system of references telling us what to believe about this person or this thing. And eventually, whatever we believe about that person or thing is going to directly influence whether or not we trust them or the thing. So, our trust in someone is nothing more than a conditioned belief system that we have about them. And similarly, whether or not someone trusts us is entirely dependent on the references and the confirmed beliefs that they have about us. So building trust in relationships is conditioned over time through many positive interactions, which is references. Every interaction that you have with someone, whether it's an email, if it's a message, if it's a phone call, if it's grabbing coffee or a beer or a drink or something with someone, or even a video chat, every single time that you're interacting with that person, you're building a reference point. And that's going to influence whether or not they trust you. And it's also going to positively or negatively affect your level of rapport with that person. And so I usually like to point to the quote that most people have heard: trust takes years to build and seconds to lose. Well, you can immediately understand that, because if trust is nothing more than a belief system, well, the moment that someone proves or does something that proves to you that you cannot trust them or that they cannot trust you, what you've done is you've completely ripped out the belief system. You've destroyed the roots, which means you have to start all over again from reference point number one. That's why trust is so important, because it takes so long to build. It takes reference points. It takes confirming beliefs over and over and over and over and over again until that belief system is very strong. And the moment that's broken, you have to start all over again. And perfect example of this is in partnerships, strategic relationships, and those are business examples, but then also in intimate relationships. The moment someone does something that breaks one of the partner's beliefs about the other partner, it's almost like starting all over again, because you've taught that person, or you've shown that person, that the belief that they had about you is not true, and you've ripped out the roots that they previously had been building. So trust is super, super, super important. So our trust in people is selective and relative. So what do I mean by that? I'll give an example. So right now, take a second and think of a close friend, whether from childhood or someone that you know really, really well. Someone that's very close to you, someone that if you were to be put in a room and someone says, all right, you need to answer 10 questions about this person, you'd probably be able to get like 6 or 7 of them, maybe 8 or 9. So, all right, now that you have that person in your head, close friend, would you trust that friend in borrowing your car and returning it to you without damage? Now, in most cases, most people say, yes, I trust my friend. Of course they can take my car. Some of you, maybe that friend has had a car wreck and totaled their car, and you're like, no way in hell. I would never allow them to use my car. But most of the time. All right, so now 2 other questions. Keeping that same friend in your mind, would you trust that same friend in managing your retirement investments? Would you trust that friend to perform a surgical operation on you? Now, assuming that your friend is not in finances or does not work with retirement portfolios or retirement investments, you'd probably said no to the first one. And assuming that your friend is not a doctor or a surgeon, you'd probably say no to the second one as well. So why did you trust your friend in borrowing a car and returning it without damage, but you wouldn't trust your friend in managing your investments or performing surgery on you? And again, this is just an example that trust is relative and it's selective because it is a system of beliefs that we have about someone. If you don't believe that your friend can manage investments or perform surgery, of course you're not going to trust him or her to do so. But if you do believe that your friend is caring, truthful, responsible, punctual, thoughtful, and knows how to drive a car, then you would trust that person in borrowing your car. So the reason I'm bringing this out is it's so important to understand how trust is formed, what it actually is, and how you can focus on building it with a person. So, trust and rapport are crucial in relationships. And two things that I want you to write down either in your journal or blank sheet of paper or anywhere where you're taking notes. There's three things, and two of them are on this slide. There are three things in relationships that you can never, ever, 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 ever forget. People help people whom they know, like, and trust. That is principle number one for relationship building, for networking, just for working with people. Psychologically, principle number one, people help people whom they know, like, and trust. And quick example I'll give here. Let's assume that you somehow, some way, all of a sudden have $10,000. Let's call it a lottery. You win $10,000 and now you have $10,000 cash. You cannot use it. You can't invest it. You can't put it away. Like, you have to 100% give all $10,000 away. You cannot keep the money for yourself. And the question I would ask is, who's the first person that you'd give it to? If you can't use it or keep it for yourself and you have to give away $10,000, all one lump sum to one person, who's that person that you would give it to? Now, normally, most people would say, well, a parent or a sibling. Usually it's someone super close to them or a wife or a family member, something like that. So usually it's the person that they're most closely connected to. And then now let's assume you can't give it to a family member. You can't give it to your brother, your sister, your wife, your husband, your parents, your children, like whatever. You can't give it to anybody that close to you. You have to give it to someone else. Who next would you give it to? This is where most people say a best friend or a close friend, someone within their friend group. Okay, well now let's assume you can't give it to your friends. No one you know as a friend, you can't give it to them. Who would you give your money to then? Then that usually leads to the third tier, which is people say, well, I'd find, something I care about, whether it's a charity or some types of contribution to people in need, but all of a sudden that's where they would put their money. So what that shows is the decisions on how you would allocate that money or how you would donate that money or give that money away followed a tier of who do I know, like, and trust the most. And professionally, it works the exact same way. People will help people who they know, like, and trust. That's why family members are almost always the first people to try to help professionally in your career. And that's also why friends are normally the second people who are most willing to help because they know you, like you, and trust you. And then when you think about referrals, that's the reason referrals are so powerful, is because they know, like, and trust you because of the mutual connection that you have in common with that person. And that's also why people you don't know, cold contacts, cold relationships are the hardest, because those people don't know you, they don't yet like you, and they don't yet trust you. So, super important principle number one, people help people who they know, like, and trust. I know I'm beating a dead horse on this, but I'm going to keep saying these things over and over and over again to make sure you never forget them. All right, now the second principle is the relationship must come first. Everything else comes second. And the reason this second principle is so important is because if you do not have a relationship, that means that they do not know you, like you, and trust you. So whatever you do, before you ever make an ask of someone, the most important thing to focus on is the relationship. Without a relationship, there's no trust. They're not going to be willing to help. All things fall apart when there's not a relationship. Businesses fall apart. Intimate relationships fall apart. Everything falls apart. People are your greatest asset when you have a relationship with them. Everything else must come second. Whatever's on your agenda, it cannot be on the agenda until you actually have through and through a true relationship with someone. So that leads us to transaction-driven networking, understanding what it is and why we do not want to do it. So reaching out to people, transaction-driven networking is reaching out to people and showing up with an expectation. You're either asking for help to get a job, you're asking for a referral, an introduction, you're asking them for some sort of resource. You show up asking for something. And the problem with this is assuming that it's someone that you don't yet know. So you reach out to a cold contact or someone at a company that you've never spoken with before. You're reaching out and immediately in their mind, they're like, here's someone who's just going to ask me for a job or ask me for to forward the resume or ask me for something. They know and they can feel and sense that you're just showing up with an expectation. And when you show up with an expectation, that's transaction-driven networking, because you're the only reason you're reaching out is because it's not that you care about having a relationship with this person or meeting them or understanding their world, their worldviews, their career path, their experiences, why they made the decisions that they did, what they enjoy most about the company, why they chose their position as opposed to other positions, what they do in their position. Like the moment you show up with an ask, you're telling them that all that stuff is not really important to me. I'm just looking for help. So, and they're not going to be willing to help you because they don't yet know you. They don't yet know you, like you, or trust you. So when you show up with an ask and an expectation and they don't yet know you, like you, or trust you, if they were to say yes, and all of a sudden, let's say they do decide to take your resume and refer it internally to a recruiter or someone else, they know that they're risking their reputation. Because the moment that they refer you or put your resume through or connect you with someone else on their team, do anything, how you perform with that other person is a direct reflection of them because they're the ones that put you forward. It's kind of like they're sticking their neck out and their head is now on the chopping block. Because if you interview horribly, or if you're rude, or if you're a jerk, or if something just ends up, bad happening throughout the process, that recruiter, the hiring manager, or the boss or the team manager, someone else on the team, they're going to go to that person and say, what the hell? That was a horrible person. That was a horrible contact. Why did you put that person forward? Why did you have them talk to me? All of a sudden, they now look bad. Now, in most cases, is that going to happen? No, but that's what's playing out in their mind. That's what they're thinking. They're thinking, I don't know this person. I don't like this person yet. I don't trust this person. If I put them through and I know nothing about them, they immediately start assuming the worst possible scenario is going to happen. So they say no. And when they say no, all of a sudden, in your mind, they're not meeting your expectation. And they feel like they're not meeting your expectation because they've now consciously chosen not to help you. That's what creates the awkwardness and tension in networking. The reason networking is so uncomfortable and so awkward and just horrible for most people is because they're constantly showing up with expectations and they're constantly having those expectations shot down, which makes both people feel totally awkward. And the reason they're getting shut down is because the other person doesn't yet know them, like them, or trust them. And that first interaction, if it goes south like that, if it goes poorly, that creates a bad reference and a bad first impression. Well, now, in that person's mind that you reached out to or whoever you just talked to, they feel guilty because they consciously decided not to help you or somehow, some way got out of it. And they feel guilty and they now associate a painful emotion or a painful experience to you. So when you reach out again, they're probably just going to ignore your email or they're going to ignore your voicemail or your call or your LinkedIn message, whatever, because they now feel guilty and uncomfortable so that they'd rather just pretend you don't exist than fess up and say, hey, yeah, I just didn't feel comfortable helping you because I didn't know you. Most people are not going to say that. So they associate pain and guilt to you, and then all of a sudden they just start ignoring you. So transaction-driven networking does not end up well. So what you need to do is completely drop all expectations. Never, ever assume that someone's going to help you. Ever. The moment you make that assumption, I'm sure you've heard this before, it makes an ass out of you and me. When you assume and show up with an expectation, things do not work out well. So always remember principle number 2 for networking: relationships must come first. Everything else comes second. So now let's actually talk about what is relationship-driven networking. Well, it's the exact opposite of transaction-driven networking. You show up with absolutely no expectations. Your sole focus is on understanding that other person. So researching their backgrounds, understanding their background, asking them questions to learn about them, their career, their company, their position, their work, their beliefs and ideas for the future, and their advice for you. So when you focus on just asking questions, learning and understanding the other person's perspective and world and career, that means that they have absolutely no pressure on them. There's no expectations for them to meet. And so it's a huge sigh of relief for them. And whenever you have a call and someone directly asks, all right, well, what do you want? Or what are you looking for? How can I help? Some people immediately just jump in and then force the ask there. One of the things that I love to say is, well, front that by saying, hey, I really appreciate you offering help. I can't express, how much that means to me, but I also want to be transparent with you that I did not, I was not expecting that. I didn't schedule this call with you to ask you for something. I really wanted to learn and ask for your advice, et cetera, et cetera. The moment that someone knows that you didn't just call them or reach out to them to ask them for something, but you actually cared about learning from them, understanding them, and asking for advice, all of a sudden their perception of you increases dramatically because there's no pressure on them. If they can help or if they choose not to help, okay, no sweat, because that's not why you reached out. So when you show up with no expectations, really what that means is everyone in the world can now help you, because everyone knows more than you in some way, shape, or form. And that means that even people in unrelated positions within a company can help you. And there have been many times, both in my personal life, but also in the people that I've worked with, and I'm sure that you've had an experience where someone who you thought wouldn't really be able to help somehow ended up being able to help. But you never could have found that out if you hadn't first talked to them, if you hadn't have had that, if you hadn't had that conversation. So when you show up with no expectations, everybody becomes a resource because you can always learn from that person. So by reaching out in this way with no expectations and asking questions, listening intently, asking then follow-up questions to learn even more and show them and demonstrate that you're listening to them, and then at the end you thank them for their insight, that first call, that first interaction is going to be, you're going to set a really good impression, a great first reference point, which immediately means that when you have a really good first reference point, they're going to feel like they know you more, like they like you more, and that they trust you more. And this is the important thing. Some people feel that networking, they feel guilty networking because they're reaching out and they're asking for people's time, or they feel like they're asking somebody for value and they're not returning value back to them equally. Well, networking and building relationships is not horse trading. It's not one for one. If you have a personal relationship where, let's say you have a boyfriend or girlfriend or a spouse, and every time you do something for them, you expect them to do something immediately for you, the relationship is going to fall apart. It's not one for one. It's not eye for eye. It's not, tit for tat. So it's whenever you're reaching out in professional networking, when someone says yes, that they would like to speak with you, really what you're doing is you're helping them to fulfill 2 human needs. So if you remember in all the way back in module 1, when we talked about 6 human needs, well, esteem and contribution are 2 very important human needs. Well, esteem, when you're asking someone for advice or for information, they feel like they're helping you. And because you're asking them, they feel important because you could have asked anyone else. And also, a lot of people, especially if they're early to mid-career, many people don't get reached out to for advice, or they don't get looked up to or sought out as a subject matter expert or an expert in any way. So when you're reaching out to them, they feel confident, like, oh, I am worthy. I am someone who can provide information and help. But then two, they feel like they're genuinely helping you, which makes them feel good about themselves. They feel like they're contributing to someone else. So not everyone is going to respond to you. And that's because not all people want to help. That's fine. And we'll talk more about that, about how many people should you expect to actually get back to you. But the important thing is to remember is most people, I wouldn't say most, but many people are naturally not going to want, they're not the people who will help. But when you find the people who do want to help, they're not doing it because they're expecting something from you. They're doing it because they genuinely want to help you. People love, and this is principle number 3 for you for networking, people love feeling heard, understood, acknowledged, and appreciated. If you want to build a really great first impression, a great reference point, and you want to start a relationship, whether it's professional or intimate or personal, social, any type of relationship, the easiest way and the best way to make a great first impression is to make the other person feel heard, understood, acknowledged, and appreciated. So you can't do this by talking yourself. If you're the one talking, you're not going to make them feel heard. If you're the one talking, it's going to be difficult to show them that you understand. Now, of course, you need to acknowledge what they're saying and show them that, paraphrase and let them know that you're understanding what they're saying. But for the most part, when you're having these networking conversations with people that you don't know, cold contacts, cold relationships, you're going to be the one primarily asking questions and just seeking to learn as much as possible from them. And by doing so, they're going to be the ones talking most of the time. And that's awesome. That's how it should be. Some people feel like when they reach out and have a conversation with someone, they need to tell their story before they start asking questions. That person most likely did not get on the phone because they cared about your story, because they wanted to hear your background. It's not about you. They got on that call because they wanted to help you. And the way that they can help you, or at least the way that they feel that they can help you, is by answering your questions, not because they want to know your background. So you're showing up, you're asking questions, and by doing so, you're going to make that person feel heard, understood, acknowledged, and appreciated. And when you make them feel that way, they feel like they know you, like you, and trust you. If you've ever read Dale Carnegie, one of his big things is if you want to make someone like you, have them talk about themselves. It's the exact same way in professional networking. Very rarely will someone ever get off a call where they were the ones predominantly talking and then walk away saying, oh, what a horrible conversation. They don't say that because they were the ones talking, so they believe it was a good conversation. So simple psychological tip, but it's super, super powerful. So this is how you build trust and rapport at the beginning of a relationship, asking questions, listening, showing them and demonstrating to them that you understand, you acknowledge what they're saying, and you appreciate them. You appreciate their insights, their advice, their recommendations. So relationship-driven networking requires the right approach. And what I mean by approach is there are 3 different ways that you can approach any conversation. So there's the student approach, the peer approach, and the teacher approach. Now, the student approach is you're primarily the one learning something. And there's a lot of, immediately when someone thinks student, they think young, someone who's in high school or someone who's in college. You could be 60 years old and leading a company and still be the student because you're learning from someone who knows more than you in a different area. So being a student is not age defined. It's not dependent on how successful you are or how old you are, anything like that. It's, can you learn something from someone else who's more believable or has more experience in some other area, whether personal or professional? So with a student mindset, you're entering a conversation. You're the one primarily asking questions and learning from the other person. And then there's a peer mindset, which is where you're talking to someone as a peer. So you're both contributing actively to the conversation. You're both responding actively. And you're both most likely asking questions and learning from one another and potentially even debating with one another. And then the teacher is when you're in the shoes of predominantly answering questions and teaching or explaining something to another person. So when you're approaching relationship-driven networking, you want to approach it with a student mindset. You want to be the one primarily asking questions and learning from the other person. And there are three main benefits of approaching networking in this way. One, you gather an enormous amount of information that most of the time, a lot of information that you learn in networking, you just can't find it online. You can't, a lot of people do, 10, 20, 30, 40, an immense amount of hours of research online when really all they need to do was have a conversation with someone in 30 minutes and get exactly what they needed. Networking is so good for information, and it's also comprehensive because you're getting someone's full story. It's not just a fragment here and a fragment there. The second thing that it gives you is resources. Sometimes if someone likes you, they'll say, hey, I have access to this, or I have this. I'd love to share it with you. I think it'd be super beneficial. All of a sudden, people start passing things your way. And then lastly is relationships. And again, the reason the relationships are so important is those must come first. And through relationships, opportunities will present themselves. All of a sudden, people are referring you. All of a sudden, people are connecting you with other people who can then help you. So those are the three most important ways. So as a quick summary, our perceived value of someone or something increases the more time and energy that we invest into it. Trust and rapport are belief systems we have about people and things, which are conditioned over time by confirming references. We build relationships through having multiple good interactions with them, and this conditions their positive beliefs about us. Your networking approach must be relationship-driven, not transaction-driven. You do this by focusing on learning from and understanding others through having a student mindset. You must make the other person feel heard, acknowledged, understood, and appreciated, which you accomplish by asking great questions, listening intently, asking follow-up questions, and then thanking them for their time and for their advice. And lastly is you help that person meet two human needs, esteem and contribution, when they're allowed to talk about themselves, share their advice, and in their minds help you, contribute to you. So they end up feeling great, which creates a great impression and a positive association to you in their mind. So by reaching out to people and learning from them, you are building relationships while at the same time you're making that other person feel great because they feel important and they also feel like they're helping you. So everyone in the world is a learning opportunity when you approach it with this mindset of, I don't have any expectations. I'm just reaching out to learn and try to understand this other person's perspective, their advice, their recommendations, and their background, their past, their history. So again, relationships must come first. Everything else comes second. One of the principles for networking, the second principle, people help people they know, like, and trust. And then the final principle, people love to be heard, understood, acknowledged, and appreciated. And the simple way that I remember that is HUAA, H-U-A-A. So once you have relationships, opportunities will naturally begin arising and presenting themselves to you. And you're also going to be a lot more informed than others, giving you a strategic and competitive advantage, not just in the career transition and in interviews and negotiation, but just overall in your career. The more relationships that you have, the more access to information both inside the company and externally in the industry, or even across industries, which is going to make you more informed and you will be more strategic. You'll be able to make better decisions than people on your team and other people within the company, which is going to give you an edge. You'll be promoted faster. You'll end up making a lot more money. Relationships are so valuable. So, relationship-driven networking leverages two powerful principles. And I want to break these down. So, principle one is the power of asking, and then the other one is the power of asymmetry. And I want to break down what those mean. So, the power of asking, you can think of as having two parts. So, the first part is just literally asking questions. So questions are super important because by asking a question, you're consciously controlling someone's thoughts. And I know this sounds kind of quirky and weird to say, but as an example, what did you have to eat for breakfast this morning? Was it eggs? Was it toast? Was it a protein shake? Like immediately you're now thinking, or I mean, you might not be because you're trying not to because I just talked about this, but when you ask a question, someone immediately thinks of the answer because our brains are wired to answer questions. We love answering questions. Even better, we love proving people wrong. That's why so many people are so quick to say, well, actually, and then they butt in with whatever they believe is the real answer. So questions are super influential when we use them properly. And when you're asking questions, the easiest way to become extremely successful in your career and in your life is become better at asking questions than anyone else in the room. You're going to get more information, you're going to build stronger relationships, and you're also going to be consciously influencing other people because you're directly influencing their thoughts. So that's benefit number one. Number two is you learn and evaluate through questions. So information expands our understanding. The more that we learn, we become more creative, we become more thoughtful. And as a result of that, we can then make better and more informed decisions than other people, which gives us a strategic advantage. And then finally, as we talked about earlier, relationships are built through questions. Because when you're the one asking questions and you're listening and asking follow-up questions, you're making the other person feel heard, understood, acknowledged, and appreciated. So now the second part of the power of asking is actually making asks of someone. So the reason there's two important reasons this is important. One, people cannot help you if they don't know how to help. Have you ever had it where you really wanted someone to help, but then they didn't help you? More often than not, it's because that one, either that person didn't know you wanted help, or two, they literally didn't know how to help you because you did not clearly ask them in a defined way what you're looking for. So the reason so few people make asks of other people is because they're afraid of rejection. They have a fear. Most people are the ones limiting themselves in their lives and in their careers because they're afraid to ask for what they want. I mean, whether you're a guy or a girl, I guarantee there's been a point in your personal life where you were afraid to approach somebody. You're afraid to ask somebody on a date. And as a result, you don't have that relationship. You didn't ask them out. We'll see the exact same way in your professional career. When you're afraid to ask for something, you're not going to get it. So most people limit themselves, and we can't allow that to happen. You cannot limit yourself. You must overcome that fear of rejection. And now the second part is receiving help, discovering opportunities, and advancing your life. The only way to do that is by asking other people for help. Other people are your greatest resource and your greatest asset. But again, most people, they might be willing to help you, but because you haven't asked, they don't know that you want help, and they also don't know how to help you. So asking is so important in life. Questions and asking people for help massively influence the trajectory of both your personal and professional life. And now you have the power of asymmetry. So asymmetric risk management, really all this means, and I know it's a bunch of big words, whatever, but what this means is that you're analyzing different potential outcomes. There's always a cost and a benefit to any decision that you make in life. And what you want to analyze is, all right, well, what is the probability and how beneficial is this one outcome? And then on the flip side, what is the probability that this cost will happen or that this negative thing will happen? And how serious is that detriment or is that negative scenario? So there's a positive scenario and a negative scenario. And we need to think about, all right, what are the probabilities of these different scenarios happening and just how beneficial or negative are they? So by reaching out to people and networking, you really only have two outcomes. One is they either don't respond and it costs you nothing more than a couple of seconds to send them a message, or two, you end up speaking with that person and you potentially build a relationship, learn an immense amount of information, maybe you receive resources from them, and they might even lead to career opportunities or personal opportunities. So on the cost, there's almost no cost. It's literally, there's no downside, but the potential upside is immense. That's asymmetry. And then in terms of asymmetric decision making, that is when you understand and you take advantage of these types of opportunities. And you want to look for these opportunities all the time in your professional career, in your personal life, but then also in terms of your financial investments. So it's having an asymmetric decision-making mindset is exactly that. It's a skill, it's a mindset, and it's something you want to develop and condition over time. It also allows you to make more logical decisions. So many people in terms of networking are very hesitant to reach out to people who are much more senior or people who are potentially 1.5 or 2 times their age. So if you're early to mid-career, that means that you're nervous or anxious or afraid to reach out to someone who's a vice president or a president or a CEO or a director or someone who's very high up within a company. That's emotion. And the reason that happens is because of the fear of rejection, that this person's going to say no, or that this person's going to say something negative about you or think negatively about you. But it's also because it also comes from self-doubt, believing that maybe you're not worthy of that person's time, or that, there's no way that that person would be willing to speak with you. Why would they want to talk to me? I'm a mere analyst, or I'm nothing but a frontline manager. So that's emotional. But when you think of networking from a logical decision-making, and specifically if you remember that it's asymmetrical, well, the moment you focus on outcomes, both beneficial and negative, it just makes sense. Why would you not reach out? The worst thing that could happen is they say no, or they just don't respond, which means that it really cost you nothing. But the potential upside is a massive increase in your career, opportunities that no one else has access to, information that no one else has access to, resources that no one else has access to. The potential upside is incredible. So always think of networking and reaching out to people logically, and always remember it's asymmetrical. And then finally, relationship-driven networking is a perfect asymmetric opportunity, which I've already said. Upside is spectacular. The downside literally costs you nothing. So what that looks like is you have an asymmetric upside scenario where you have the cost is nothing, it's flat, but the upside is unlimited. And then an asymmetric downside scenario is really when there's almost no upside, but the potential downside is horrific. So always, whenever you're thinking, and we want to look for these, we want to look for upside scenarios, and we want to always avoid the downside scenarios. So when we think about relationship-driven networking, the way that we can think about it is the power of asking is our willingness to overcome the emotions and to say, look, I know I might be a little afraid, I might be a little fearful. What if they don't get back to me? Whatever. You push that aside. You remember how beneficial it is to make the ask, and then you do make the ask. The potential upside could be relationships, information, resources, opportunities, and advancing your life and career. And really the only downside is a potential rejection. Someone says no, or they just don't get back to you, which is totally fine. Your life will go on. That affects you in no way, shape, or form. So, questions to ask yourself whenever you feel that you need to make one of these decisions and you feel like the emotions are getting the best of you. You know it's a smart idea, a good idea to do something, but you're nervous or fearful or whatever. One, always ask yourself, what is the worst potential outcome? Two, what's the probability of that worst potential outcome happening? Because a lot of people say, oh, well, I reach out to the CEO or this, VP, and they think I'm an idiot, and then they tell everybody and they blacklist me from the company, or they do something horrific. It's like, okay, what's the probability that that's going to happen? 1%, less than 1%, some ridiculously small scenario. You have a higher probability of being in a deathly car accident driving on the road than you do of some ridiculous, horrific, career-related bad outcome from professional networking. So that's a really dark example, sorry. But one, always ask yourself when you're doing the networking, what's the potential outcome? The worst potential outcome, what is then the probability of that thing actually happening? Three, what are the most probable outcomes and their costs and benefits? And then what logical decision will I now make based on these different probable outcomes? So that's it for this first part one. In part two, we're going to actually discuss, okay, if part one is about the approach, the philosophy of networking, in part two, we're going to break down how do you actually then take this approach, systematize it, and go about reaching out to people and beginning to build those professional networks and open up opportunities for yourself. So thanks. I hope you took some notes, reflect on some of these thoughts, and I'll see you in part two.